Welcome to episode 180 of the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. This is Melisa Liberman, and today we're going to just go right at it. Right at it. By that, I mean, I want to talk with you about the situation where you might be questioning if your independent consulting business is worth it. Does that thought cross your mind occasionally or frequently? That question, is my independent consulting business worth it? Is this worth it? And I've got maybe some surprising news for you here today. So let's dive into this topic because this is really important to, if you're asking yourself this question, which most of us are at some point or the other, it's really important to answer it. And so that's what I want to help you with here today. That listen, there's nothing to be afraid of. Sometimes we don't like to ask ourselves questions because we really don't want to know the answer. And there's really nothing to be afraid of here. This is an important question to ask yourself every now and then. If even intentionally ask yourself, you're probably asking yourself on and off, is this even worth it? But let's ask ourselves that question intentionally so that then you have more ability to be successful in whatever you choose to do. All right. So that's what we're doing here today. Before we dive in, though, I just have to share a little story with you. So, a couple of episodes ago, I was sharing with you that the concept of qualifying your consulting clients and the fact that you are truly qualifying them, or you should be qualifying them as much as they're qualifying you. And in that episode, I think it was 178, we talked about having a scorecard to really get clear about what you're looking for, what types of questions you would be asking a potential client to determine if they're a good fit for what you do and how you want to work, and so on. You can go back and listen to the full episode, but that's the gist of it. So anyway, I was working with my coach last week. He and I were talking through a few things in my business. And then we got onto the topic of qualifying potential clients and what my criteria is. And we were talking through all of that. And anyway, the end result from that conversation and some optimizations I'm creating in my business is that I need a scorecard, like a formal scorecard, just like I recommended that you have a couple of episodes ago. The irony of it was definitely not lost upon me that so often, and you may relate to this, so often we recommend things to our clients and then we completely forget or overlook or just miss the fact that also applies to our own businesses. So I just had to share that with you because I hear that so often from independent consultants when they say to me, this isn't what I would recommend to my own corporate clients, but I'm doing X, Y, or Z, or I do recommend X, Y, or Z to my corporate clients. And I notice I'm not doing it for myself. So I just had to share that with you because I just did it. I just did the thing that so many of us do when we are running our own business. It can be really hard to get out of your own way. And so just a little bit of normalizing that it happens. It happens to the best of us. It happens to those of us who know better, as I'm sure you do. And quite frankly, that's why I personally have a coach at all times, because it's so easy to see things for other people's businesses and where they might be getting in their own way or what their blind spots are, but it can be so hard to see it for ourselves. So anyway, I thought you might get a laugh out of that as I did with my coach, and to have that scorecard formally in place now in my business too. So with that, now let's shift gears and talk about the topic of the day. Are you at the point in your business where you're questioning whether running your business and staying as an independent consultant is worth it? It is more common than you would imagine. You are not alone. That's why I'm recording this episode if this is the situation you're in. And I want to share with you some frameworks today to help you through this process. So, the first is I'll just share with from an agenda perspective. First, we'll talk about, does this sound familiar? So I'll just give you a scenario of an independent consultant, one of the inspirations for this episode, and share with you what they're going through. And from the perspective of just helping you to see that this is a normal part of running a business. And there's nothing that is wrong with it, but there are some things that you want to definitely do about it in order to maintain a healthy practice and ultimately a healthy mindset and really intentional purpose for yourself for the future. from a bigger picture perspective. So we'll first start off and just talk about, does this sound familiar? And then we'll go into that question, is it worth it? And then I'll share with you a 3-part framework that you can leverage to answer that question for yourself. Is it worth it to continue running your business? Maybe it's run its course, or maybe it hasn't, and that question is distracting you. So I'll help you with that 3-part framework so that you can really sort this out and not be just kind of watered down with this question of, is it worth it? That ends up diluting your impact for you as a business owner because you're not fully in it when you're asking, is this worth it? It also makes it so much less fulfilling for you to run your business when you have that cloud over your head of, is this worth it? And then we'll wrap up today's episode with, I'll share with you 5 questions that you can leverage to put this episode into action for yourself. 5 high quality questions to ask yourself and answer so that you know the answer to, is it worth it or not, at least for some period of time. All right. So with that, let's dive into the first thing I want to share with you, which is the companion resource that goes with this episode. It is the 14-point business health assessment. This will go along with one of the parts of the framework that I'll share with you, which is, I won't tell you what the framework is. We'll leave that here for a moment before I get ahead of myself. But I will tell you and really highly recommend that you go take this assessment periodically just to figure out where is your business the healthiest, and also to identify areas of opportunity. So you can find that at icassessment.com. The 2 letters IC for independent consultant, assessment.com. It walks you through those questions and gives you a report and a score by area so that you know where to prioritize to make the biggest impact on your business and ultimately set yourself up to reach your goals and beyond. All right. So that is the companion resource for today. Now let's dive into, is it worth it? Is it worth it? Does it sound familiar? The example that I'll give you, or the inspiration for this episode, is the scenario where kind of the newness of your business may have worn off by now. You may be doing this for a couple of years or 20 years, however long it might be. And the newness of running a business has worn off. That kind of initial exhilaration of realizing that you can set your own schedule and you can decide who you work with and you get to decide how much money you make. All of those things that are brand new have likely worn off when you start asking yourself this question. Maybe you landed a first few set of clients from your network and then you start wondering, how am I going to sustain this? That's the point at which the consultant who's the inspiration for this episode was at. She had been running her business for about 7 years and got to the point where all of the new things, all of the newness had really worn off. The brand newness had, certainly been long gone after 7 years doing this. But, over the course of time, she had built a lot of systems in her business, had a lot of wins in her business, had a lot of really interesting client work and some not so interesting client work under her belt. And just got to the place where it was feeling kind of mundane, like a merry-go-round. She was just on this merry-go-round. The newness had worn off. And she was feeling just left with this sort of perpetual process where she had to land clients and deliver and figure out how to juggle delivery with business development. And she hit a juncture where this all came to a head in the sense of she had neglected her pipeline. A client contract had ended early, and she started worrying about cash flow and almost feeling like she was starting from scratch in some ways. Starting from scratch in the sense that her pipeline was empty or she thought it was empty, we'll put it that way, and that she was in her mind facing the decision of, do I want to restart up what I start up and get my pipeline going again and kind of go through all of this again, like I've been doing for the last 7 years? Or do I want to take a step back and entertain going back to corporate, having a full-time job again and going down that path? And so my question for you today is, does this sound familiar in some form or fashion? Do you notice yourself asking that question, no matter where you're at in terms of the number of years or months you've owned your business, or how many clients you've landed, or what your pipeline looks like? Do you notice yourself asking yourself that question of, is it worth it? it can feel very hard to run a consulting business. It can feel really hard to run any type of business. And so it would be very common to be asking yourself that question, is it worth it? Or maybe it's not kind of this big existential question for you, but maybe it's just a smaller question where someone started ghosting you that you thought would become a client and the proposal process had been going really well, and then all of a sudden they started ghosting you, or a client contract ended early, or you were negotiating an engagement and ended up settling on a fee structure that you weren't super happy with. It may be just a point in time as well, or you got in this morning that said a client wasn't happy with a deliverable and then you needed to rework it or engage more people from the client to move it over the goal line. Whatever the thing is, it can be very common, either on a big picture level or even just on a day to day level, to ask yourself that question, is it worth it? And so the reason why I went into that example for you and the several examples for you is because it's really important to normalize the fact that this is a common situation, a common question that consultants ask themselves. And sometimes you may get to the place where you're asking yourself that question every single day. And it doesn't mean that anything has gone wrong. It doesn't mean that there's a problem. It doesn't mean that you even need to answer the question, although you may want to. And I'll give you the framework here today to figure out the answer to it. But I just want to share with you that just because you're asking yourself, is this worth it? Doesn't mean that you are now at a juncture where it might make sense to go back to corporate. That question in and of itself. Okay, so now that you know other people are also asking themselves the same question, let's talk about what it might sound like in your mind. Should I go back to full time corporate or should I do something else? Maybe it's not even going back to full time corporate. It's just, is this worth it or not? Maybe I should retire or maybe I should go back to full time corporate. Maybe I should open a different type of business. Or for me, sometimes I think I should work at Starbucks. Like, I think this is really hard. Maybe I should just go like work at Starbucks, or I don't know why Starbucks comes to my mind because there's a lot of reasons why that would not be a good fit for me. But we just try to think about whatever example might be. Feels like in your mind that might be the easiest thing to do, like a no-brainer thing you could go do. No one's giving you a hard time. That's why Starbucks is a bad example. I don't know why my mind goes there, but it does. I'm sure there's plenty of people giving those baristas a hard time, but you see what I'm saying. Like, it's so like this grass is greener type of a situation. And so it's so normal for that, right? Is it worth it? You might be asking, like, would it be easier to go do X, Y, and Z? Or would I feel more confident doing X, Y, or Z? Maybe that's where the barista comes from. I can make a Keurig coffee. Maybe I can figure out how to make a Starbucks coffee. I would feel better at it. I wouldn't feel so up and down about, am I good at this or not? Or you might be asking yourself, would I be less lonely? Or would I make more money if I did something different? Or would it be easier to make the money I want to make? All of those kinds of questions are another indicator that you're in this zone of questioning whether or not being an independent consultant is worth it. And before we dive into the framework to help you really truly answer, is it worth it or not? And then what to do about it? The first thing I want to say is there's truly no right or wrong answer, right? We don't know the answer to, is it worth it? But what I will say is, first of all, I want to acknowledge that I'm very biased in this way. Obviously, this is what I do for a living. Is I am an independent consultant myself. I have been an independent consultant for the last 12 years. I coach independent consultants, helping them to succeed. So this is my life in so many different ways. So I just want to first and foremost acknowledge that I am biased here. And I will always encourage you to figure out a way to make it worth it as an independent consultant 99 times out of 100, because I know and believe in you that you can figure out how to make your business work and how to make it worth it, and that you can feel more confident and clear and convicted that consulting is the right path for you, that it does give you that autonomy and that ability to make more than you were making in corporate, and to have your ability to create your own employer of choice in so many ways. So obviously, just to put that on the table, I am definitely biased here, but I will also say to you that independent consulting is not right for everyone all of the time. And so you may be at a place right now where you're deciding, should I go do something different, whether it's going back to corporate or getting a different type of a job or starting a different business. You may be at that point. And so I want to help you today to tease this apart, to figure out, is this truly a valid question or not? And also what to do about it, how to answer the question. Because leaving an open circuit in your brain, an unanswered question, saps you of your energy. It saps you of your ability to be as impactful as you could be and makes it less worth it when you've got this open loop in your mind. And so that's what I really want to make sure that when we walk away from today's episode, you've got the framework in place to go answer that question for yourself so that you aren't wasting that energy, that valuable energy and mind share on this type of question. Is it worth it? Okay, so with that bias out of the way, I want to reemphasize one last time before we dive into the framework that this is normal. Nothing has gone wrong. The fact that you're asking yourself this question, is it worth it? Let's just be honest. Think about all the different things that you've decided to do in your life, whether it's get married or move to a certain place or live in a certain place or quite frankly have kids. Whatever it is that you've done, there are likely times, maybe more often than you're willing to admit, that you ask yourself, is it worth it? I will tell you, we just started school today. So the summer is now officially over in terms of, all day responsibility of having the kids at home. And there were times this summer where I'm like, is this worth it? Is this worth it? Is it worth it? Was it worth it having all these children, three of them? Of course, the answer is yes. But there were times where I was questioning that when they were fighting with each other and arguing and crying, all the things, right? So I just want to re-emphasize this, that this isn't the only place in your life you're likely asking yourself on occasion, is it worth it? And so because this is a normal part of life, it's important to deal with it, to know the answer to this. Now, again, we want to just be clear about, are we just asking ourselves sort of a rhetorical question? Sometimes it's just a rhetorical question. So being really clear for yourself, is this just a rhetorical question that I'm asking myself that's not that valuable? First and foremost, if it's a rhetorical question, like, is it worth it to have these three kids? That's obviously a rhetorical question that I was asking myself, if I'm just being honest, at the risk of outing myself as a bad mom. Is it worth it? Yes. Sometimes that's just a rhetorical question that we get ourselves into when things are feeling particularly challenging. So it may not be a question even worth answering. That's the first thing I'll say to you is really parse out, is this a rhetorical question that I'm asking myself that's not a high quality, valuable question? Because we've talked on this podcast before about the concept of our brain goes to work answering the question in the exact way we ask it. So if I ask myself, is it worth it? Then I'm like waiting, right? What parts are worth it? What parts aren't worth it? Like this kind of thought process going on, usually subconsciously or behind kind of in the background, trying to answer this question, is it worth it? That's a lot of mental cycles to be applying to some kind of rhetorical question. So the first thing that I encourage you to do is just ask yourself, am I really deciding if it's worth it or not? And if you're not, then one of the easiest tools that I can share with you is to acknowledge that you're asking yourself a rhetorical question and just simply telling yourself, we're not doing that today. Like, for example, when my kids are in the middle of all of these summer arguments and fighting, it kind of reminds me of one of those cartoons where it's like these like two animals or three animals sort of going around in circles with all this dust around them. That's kind of the visual that I've got from this summer. But asking myself, is this worth it? Was not a valuable question. So I would just redirect my brain to say, obviously, that's not a valuable question. We're not doing that today. And then move on to something that is more valuable. So that's the first thing. You really want to know if this is a rhetorical question or not. And then we move into assuming it's not at this moment for you a rhetorical question, that you really truly are wondering if running an independent consulting business is worth it. I want to share with you this three-part framework that you can leverage to figure out and recommit, redecide that your business is worth it or not, whatever the answer ends up being, so that then you can do something with that information and help yourself to move forward versus leaving this as an open loop in your mind that never gets answered properly and ends up watering down both your ability to be the most successful business owner you can be, and also waters down the level of joy and fulfillment that you're gaining from your business. So, here are the three parts to this framework in terms of asking yourself, is your business worth it? The first part of this three-part framework is what's called your why. Why are you running this independent consulting business? This originally came from Simon Sinek, so I want to give him proper credit for this. There's a TED Talk out there that you can go grab. He also has a book called Start With Why. I think there's a companion to that, maybe a Finding Your Why workbook or something like that. All three of those resources are really excellent. We'll put the links to those in the show notes. But really, truly getting clear. And just to be clear, when he recorded this episode, it was more about being an effective business leader. So we're just repurposing this concept for you as an independent consultant business owner. So just as a caveat there. But the concept here is really knowing, why are you doing this? Running an independent consulting business, as with anything that's really worth it, is not easy. There are definitely ups and downs. There are definitely times where you don't feel as motivated as you feel at other times. There's definitely this roller coaster, this merry-go-round, or whatever you want to call it for yourself. It's not all roses, right? And so getting very clear about, why are you doing this? For me, when I was in the middle of pure consulting, B2B consulting, and I think I've shared with you this story on the podcast before. It got to the point where the client would call me at all hours of the day and night and need something or want me to hop on a meeting. I would be like driving with those three kids in the back seat. They were like, 1, 3, and 6 or something, fighting. They're always fighting. I pulled over to the side of the road and took a meeting with the laptop on the hood of my car, which obviously is questionable from a safety perspective. But the point is, you just start asking yourself, is this worth it? At that point, it definitely was not worth it. But what was worth it is the reason why I was doing it. The reason why I was doing it is because I wanted to have that flexibility. I wanted to have the ability to make my own schedule. And so rather than throwing all of that out and saying, you know what, I can't do this anymore, it's not worth it anymore, I'm going to go back to corporate where at least things are a little bit more predictable, I reminded myself, okay, why am I doing this? I'm doing this so that I do have flexibility. I'm doing this so that I can work when I want to work and I can take the kids to the pool or to whatever music class, at that time at their ages, so that I can have full ownership over my own schedule while at the same time continuing to progress my professional goals. And so that's an example of why. Now, the fix to the situation I just described to you wasn't for me to go back to corporate. The fix for me was to put better boundaries in place with my clients so that chaos wasn't happening anymore and that I could truly accomplish the reason why I was doing that in the first place. So for you, think about, what is your why? Why did you choose to go down this route? Which in so many ways is not the easiest path to go down. But why are you doing this? And get more clear if you don't have something that's compelling, or you might have had a very compelling reason, but it's just not as applicable anymore. Maybe you had kids at home when you started your business and now you no longer do. Maybe it's time to revisit your why. Why are you doing this? And get very clear with yourself about what's driving you and why you've created this business and why you want to continue running this business if you do, rather than just trying to figure out how to make it better for yourself. You want to start at that more root level. So that's the first part of the 3-part framework. The second part is, I like to say to my clients when we're working on topics like this, like, what's the math? What are the realities? What is the hard and fast truth here? Because a lot of times we think things, but when we actually go to quantify them or create facts around them, it's not true. What we're thinking is not necessarily the truth. So the second part of this framework is to get clear on your reality. What are the facts of your business? What are the facts around why you're asking yourself, is it worth it or not? So, for example, you might be saying to yourself, like that example I gave you earlier, look, my pipeline's empty, so I might as well just decide whether I want to keep doing this or not, or go back to corporate because I'm kind of starting from scratch anyway. That might sound very factual, but the fact of the matter is that it's almost always not factual, that type of sentence. My pipeline's empty anyway. Go ask yourself the true facts. The true facts, as an example, might not be that your pipeline is empty because likely you've been talking to people all along the way, even if you haven't been working on business development, quote unquote, officially. You've likely been talking to people, even if it's your existing client. Your pipeline isn't empty. You have a client, let's say. Your client may have other business units that could benefit from your work. Your existing client might have other follow-on work that where you could be adding value. You likely have a network from your life that you haven't recently kept up with or talked to. Those are potential inputs into your pipeline. I'll give you another example. I was working with a client a while back and she told me, look, I've been so heads down with my client delivery. And just to be honest, I haven't been working on business development. My pipeline is empty and I'm worried. I'm worried. And I said, how do you know your pipeline is empty? And it seemed like a strange question at the time because she could show me her pipeline in an Excel spreadsheet or whatever tool she was using and show me there was nothing there. But the fact was that she had been going to different industry events once a quarter-ish, that she had a lot of people in her network who, if she just merely made a phone call to catch up with them, would likely lead to an opportunity or to a connection or referral of some sort. Her pipeline wasn't actually empty, is what she realized. So for you, that's an example here. It could be any other form of example of that's causing you to ask yourself, is your business worth it? But you want to get clear on the reality. And when you say things to yourself like, my pipeline is empty, I strongly suggest you give the opposite question equal airtime. You might think your pipeline is empty and show yourself it is because there's nothing in the Excel spreadsheet or your CRM. But also ask yourself, if I wanted to start pursuing a pipeline again, who might be the 5 potential clients that would first go into that pipeline? I bet you would list out 10 when you asked yourself to list 5. So get really clear about the reality before you start making decisions based on perceptions in your mind, which very, very rarely, when we just operate off of the way we're thinking by default, very, very rarely do we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. So that's why you want to get really clear about the reality, because usually we're not giving ourselves the benefit of the doubt when we're just going off of our thought process or our perceptions versus the math. So first we have your why. That's the first part of this framework. Getting really clear about why are you running an independent consulting business? Why did you choose this path? What would make it feel so successful for you? The second part of the framework is to get really clear about the reality. It might feel really desperate at the moment or failing at the moment or mundane at the moment. Get really clear about the reality versus going off of those perceptions. And then the last part of this framework is to take those inputs for yourself and make a decision. Make a decision. Is your business worth it? What would make your business worth it? Ask it that way instead. What would make this business worth it? And then decide for some period of time. You might decide X, Y, and Z would make my business worth it. If I was able to start selling more advisory type work on a retainer, that meant that I was making 30 or 40K per month at a minimum, it would definitely be worth it. And then go answer the question about how do you bring that to reality? And choose that for a period of time. I like to set a deadline. Listen, I decided this is worth it, and I'm going to decide it's worth it for the next 6 months, and I'm not going to redecide or ask myself the question anymore, is it worth it for the next 6 months? And then in the 6-month mark, you can revisit this framework again and decide, is this what you want to be doing? The last thing I'll say about that third part of the 3-part framework, which is deciding whatever you decide you want to do based on what is your reason for doing it and what is the truth or the reality. Do you want to continue operating your business and choosing that for a period of time and knowing that I love that saying, let's just choose our hard. Sometimes we think the grass is greener. Like my example, working at Starbucks. I know saying this out loud to you, there are many ways that working at Starbucks is not easier than running an independent consulting business, even though it seems like it, right? So, really, just knowing that you're going to be choosing your hard, that the grass is not always greener on the other side or rarely greener on the other side. So, know that you're choosing your hard and choosing what you truly want in life as a result of that. Okay, so now let's move on to something that's important to address here before wrap up the episode and share with you those 5 questions to help you put this episode into action. And that is sometimes unexpected opportunities come out of nowhere. You might be offered a full time job that feels too hard to pass up, or you might be offered to buy another business that someone wants to exit from. You might win the lottery. I don't know. Unexpected opportunities come our way all the time. And so the thing that I want to suggest for you is not making a decision about that unexpected opportunity from the place of, is it worth it? Is it worth it to keep running my business or to take this other thing? Or are you trying to run away from what feels hard in your business? And getting very clear with yourself about that so that you're making what I like to call a clean decision, a decision that comes from confidence rather than self doubt. Okay, so with that, let's wrap up today's episode with the 5 questions that I want to share with you to help you to implement these 3-part framework in your business. And here are the questions, and we'll put these in the show notes as well. Number 1, answer for yourself, why are you running this independent consulting business? Like I said, you may think you already know the answer to this question. For me, when I very first started, my oldest son was 2. That's all I had, one son. Now there are 2 more. The answer is very different from having 1 2-year-old to 3 kids, one of whom is in 8th grade, so he's almost in high school, and the other 2 are in elementary. The answer is very different than it was when they were really, really little. And for you, the same thing may be happening. If you've been doing this for a while, the answer of why you're doing this is likely different. So get really clear with yourself about, why are you choosing to run your independent consulting business? What are the actual drivers for you? So that then when it does feel hard, when you get to the place where you're questioning, is it worth it? You always have that back to redirect back to. The other question I love asking and answering is, what are the 1 to 2 changes that would make it feel easier? When we ask ourselves the question, is it worth it? That implies that it's hard, that it's very hard. And sometimes it can be, but you can also be asking and answering for yourself, what are the 1 to 2 changes I can make in my business that would make it feel easier? For me, for example, going back to that story I shared with you, I put in some very firm business hours and just let my client know, I'm not going to be answering your texts all day long. I will be very responsive to you, but it's not going to be all day long. By the way, he was fine with that. It was me who was worried that I wasn't being responsive enough. So for you, ask yourself and answer, what are the 1 to 2 changes that would make it feel easier? The third question, what are you committing to? What are you committed to? Ask yourself, what are you committed to? Are you committed to this business? And if not, why? And if so, why? Why are you committed to that? Maybe it's you're committed to running this business and getting it to $1 million solo independent consulting business in the next 5 years. Why are you committed to that? How long are you committed to that before you want to revisit it? Maybe you want to commit for the next year to go all in without questioning whether or not it's worth it, to see what will happen as a result of that. And then finally, I want to remind you to ask yourself, what is the math of this situation? What is the truth? Is it true that this is hard? Is it true that you have an empty pipeline? Is it true that you're not good at sales? Is it true that all of those things? How is it? The better question is, how is it not true that my pipeline is empty? How is it not true that I'm bad at sales? How is it not true that it takes a long time to land a client? Revisiting the math of this is really important. So that's a 5th question that you want to be answering. And then finally, I recommend that you reach out to talk with me about whether or not coaching together would be a good fit. Sometimes having that external perspective to see where you're getting in your own way, to see where you're not giving yourself the credit that you deserve, to see where your business can be easier and not feel so heavy for you or unsustainable for you. So if that feels like something that's of interest, I recommend going over to consultmelisa.com and you can apply there for a coaching consultation. Very informal. There's zero pressure in this process, but we just spend an hour together talking about what are your goals for your consulting business? Why haven't you yet hit those goals? What's standing in your way, to help you uncover the blind spots and to ultimately decide if coaching would be a good fit for you to help you to reach the goals and make it much more fulfilling and joyful as you are running your consulting business, so that you just ask yourself the question less and less, is it worth it? All right, my friends, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you again next week. Take care. Thanks for joining me this week on the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. If you liked today's episode, I have 3 quick next steps for you. First, click subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Next, leave me a review in your podcast app so other independent consultants can find and benefit too. And finally, to put the ideas from today's episode into action, head over to melisaliberman.com for the show notes and more resources to help you grow your consulting practice from your first few projects into a full-fledged business. See you next week.